the last video, I provided you with a comprehensive overview of what the site size measuring technique is. We also covered how to set up your drawing board properly and also how to work effectively with your reference images. In this video, we're going to learn all about constructs. We're also going to go through a thorough demonstration as to how to apply the site size measuring technique, and we're going to review a few essential tools and how to use them properly. So before we get started, I'd like to take a few minutes to actually talk about what a construct really is, why we do them, what their purpose is, and what we're looking for specifically when we're producing one. A construct is actually a preliminary drawing that serves as a blueprint and a base or foundation in which to build the rest of the drawing on. It's actually a simple, basic structure of the image that we're creating. We generally do it on a separate piece of paper, not always, but certainly at the beginning of your skill building development, it's a good idea to do it on a separate piece of paper, and there's a number of reasons for that. The first one being is that you're just learning, and so you're going to be making mistakes, and there'll be a lot of erasing and redrawing. So when you're working on good paper, it's first of all, it's expensive, and secondly, it's also can be quite delicate. And so all of this erasing and redrawing process, it can actually really break the paper down and ruin the paper. So it's a good idea to work out this stage on a separate piece of paper and then transfer it over onto your good paper. And the second reason to put it on a separate piece of paper is it allows you to actually resize the image when it's done. If you choose to try to different sizes, to put it on different surfaces, you may want to work with different kinds of paper, different kinds of mediums, put it on a canvas or a board. It allows you that flexibility to work with the image without having to redo the construct over and over and over again. Doing a construct or a drawing is very similar to actually when you think of how they build a building. What they do is they go in and they create a blueprint, and then they go out and they survey the land, and when they take measurements and then they actually plot stakes in the land, and they basically establish where the building is going to be. And from there they lay a foundation. And that foundation has to basically hold the rest of the building up. And at this stage, they're not doing it in a sloppy or willy-nilly fashion. They're very, very careful to make sure that everything is absolutely accurate, because that is what everything else has to be built on. And that is the premise of a construct. This is the stage of the drawing where accuracy really, really counts, because later on is where you don't want to find out that the forehead is too narrow, or that the eye is in the wrong place, or the nose is too long, or the lips are too big, or whatever the heck it is. You want to make sure that you establish that right now at the very beginning, before you then put in all this time and energy into everything else. That's the purpose of a construct. I see new students doing this all the time. We'll get to an early part in the drawing, and then they'll run home and then they'll finish the drawing. And then the next week they come in with a finished drawing. But the problem is that they haven't really learned to establish that base level yet. And they end up making all the same mistakes all over again, week after week after week, rather than going through the process. And they get very, very frustrated. It's frustrating for me, it's frustrating for them. So what I always tell new students is the best thing that you can be doing to improve your drawing skills is actually not drawing finished drawings, but actually drawing constructs. This is where you are really going to learn how to draw and establish. What you're doing is you're training your eye to actually see proportions, values, angles, and shapes. And that's what you're doing in here. And to learn that and begin to develop the artist's eye is the single best thing that you can do early in your development to help you to be able to draw accurately. So when we begin, we actually start with the large proportions. We establish the height of the head, the width, this part, where this part is, how wide this is, and we basically work from large to small. We work from the big proportions and the accurate angles, then we move into the smaller areas and smaller proportions and shapes inside, and that's how we begin to build the drawing. So at this stage of the drawing, we're not interested in details. We're not interested in our range of values so much. None of that is important at this stage. What we're interested in, though, is making sure that everything is correct. All these shapes are correct. And we're interested also in breaking down our darks from our lights. What we want to do is create very simple graphical shapes. We're not really interested in eyes, nose, lips, and mouths and all that sort of thing. What we're interested are the shadow shapes that the light creates as a result of how the light plays across the face. And then we want to break those shapes down into a dark and light shape. And what the difference is between these dark and light shapes are, the dark shapes are actually what's called shadow shapes. And what distinguishes them is the value tone that they fall in. So when we look at our value scale that's been provided on the reference piece, you'll see that everything goes from 0 to 100. So there are shadow values which we look at to create shadow shapes. They're generally within the 60 to 100 value range. Anything that's darker than that basically constitutes a shadow. Anything that's in sort of the 50 to 30 range in here, those are our midtones, and we group those in with our lights at this stage of the drawing. The reason being is because a lot of these can be developed as we're developing our edges and during transitions, and also if we make them too dark and have a line there, we'll have a line in the middle of our area, which we don't want. So basically what we're looking for is the separation between darks and lights. And when we look at it, what we're actually looking at are the shapes that those dark shadows create, and we call them shadow shapes. And these shapes, when we're creating them, what we're trying to do is make them simple and graphical and architectural. And what I mean by that is that we have a tendency to be sort of straight lines, squared off, and simplified into a very graphic shapes. We don't want roundness, we don't want shading, we don't want any of that. We want it simple and graphical. And the reason is, you'll see this when we transfer the drawing to our other paper, having that simplicity actually really works in our favor, because the more you work on a drawing, the more these edges start to break down. And so if it's already very subtle, then you're losing too much information too early in the game. So you want these strong graphical shapes. So as we move forward, what we're trying to achieve, and the hallmarks of a good construct, are that they're simple, they're accurate, they're very graphical, and that they break down the lights and the darks. And this is what we're going to do as we move forward into doing this construct. So let's take a look at how to measure properly. I'd like you to take whichever instrument you ended up choosing, and we're going to learn how to hold it and use it properly. So when you're using your measuring stick, what you're going to use, I happen to be right-handed, so I'm using my left hand, my non-dominant hand, in order to hold my measuring stick. And what I do, I just hold it like this, predominantly held by these three fingers, my thumb and my two middle fingers. My forefinger is left free to slide up and down and move in order to make the measurement, so that when I hold it, I go like this, and then I can see how far the measurement is. And I'm using my fingernail in order to make that measurement. So what you'll do is hold your measuring stick, and it also allows you to scrunch your hand in so that you can hold it very, very sort of close to the paper. And then you'll take a measurement. You'll measure from your axis point in the middle, take your fingernail to mark the point wherever you're measuring from, and then you'll just simply transfer it over onto the paper that you're working on and use that to make a mark with your pencil. And you'll continue to do this all the way through the construct building process. And when you want to establish an angle, such as the jawline here, or where the scarf is, or any of the angles that are on the drawing, what you'll do is extend your arm out full length and lock your elbow. And why you want to do this is it's going to give you stability. So what you'll do is then you'll take and you'll measure the angle that you're trying to establish, and then simply pivot your arm over to your own paper and make the mark. If it's off, then go back, double check, and make sure that it's accurate, and then come back again. And if the mark is off, then simply make whatever correction you need to make. Go back, check, and do this, and eventually you'll get the mark at the angle that you want. So you'll notice that my pencils are sharpened differently. I have them sharpened to a very, very long, fine point, and there's a reason for that. First of all, having them at a very fine point like that actually gives you a lot more control over the end result. You can get a lot more detail, you can get in there and do very, very fine work that you couldn't with a regular sharpened pencil. You also don't have to sharpen your pencil as often. Actually, sharpening your pencil like this changes the way that you draw, and for the better. So let's get started. First, I'm going to take my pencil, and I've got my utility knife. It's a pretty strong, sturdy utility knife, and I'm going to go back about 1 inch or 1.5 inches from my pencil. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the wood and begin to scrape it off away from the lead. And I'm doing it in a certain way. I'm not gouging, I'm careful not to gouge into the lead. What I do is I go down and then out in order to just basically pull the wood away from the lead. And that's my objective here. So that's what I'm going to do. And all I'm trying to do is expose my lead. But I do not want to gouge the lead because it'll weaken the lead and it will have a tendency to make it break. So very quickly I can expose maybe about an inch or so of my lead, like this. Then what I'm going to do is take some sandpaper. Now this is about a 220 grit. You can go maybe about a 150, but anything less than that, it's going to be too coarse. And basically what's going to happen as you sharpen your pencil against it, it'll just chew your pencil apart and your lead will just disintegrate. If it's much finer than this, if it's a 400 grit or whatever, you'll be sitting there sanding all day long. I find that really 150 to a 220 grit is really the optimal in order to sharpen your pencils. So I take a little sheet of this paper, not very big. It's big enough basically to sit in the palm of my hand in a way that I can curl it. And what happens is my hand acts as a kind of a soft cushion for when I'm sanding my lead, so it won't snap. So I'm going to put the sandpaper in the cup of my hand, and then what I do is I take my pencil lead like this, then near the edge I'm simply going to run my lead back and forth, and while I'm doing it I'm twisting it around like this, so that what I'm doing is I'm sanding the sides, but I'm getting it even on all the sides. And I just keep going with a little more pressure on the front rather than, you know, absolutely flat, because then you're just going to end up sanding the sides down. So I put a little more pressure on the front and I just sand this thing back and forth, back and forth. And eventually what will happen is that you will end up with a beautiful sharp point like this. And this is exactly what we're looking for. We're looking for this kind of a sharp point. I want it needle sharp. And that's what would allow us to actually get into the weave of the paper. So why is it important to have your pencil sharpened this way? Well, the main reason is that if your pencil is just sharpened like you would normally have it, the tendency is to actually hold the pencil the way you learned back in school when you were learning how to write. And what you end up is you hold it way back down here, and you can really only get a very limited range of motion when you do that. I mean, I'm sort of moving my arm, and that's about as far as I can go because everything is bound by pretty much, you know, my fingers, and that's it. That's as far as I'm going to go. And it sort of has a tendency to, you know, cramp our style, quite literally. But when we have our pencil sharpened this way, first of all, you can't even hold it like that. It's you physically can't do it. You're too close down the lead, and it's physically impossible to do it. And so you're forced by default to hold the pencil further back, which is actually the way you should be holding it when you're drawing. This is the better way to draw for a whole host of reasons. So by holding your pencil further back, there's a couple of things that are happening here. First of all, you can get a much larger range of motion, just right off the bat. You draw differently. You can suddenly, your initial marks can be infinitely longer. And what it does is actually give you a lot more control. First of all, in terms of, you know, the size of your strokes. But because the lead is so delicate and thin, you can't just, you know, hold it really hard and sort of force the lead. You have to deal with it in a much more delicate fashion. And it allows you to have a lot more control over your drawings. And you can get in there and do very, very, very fine work. But with the tip, you can control the pressure a lot better. You can control everything about the way that this lead performs compared to like a normal kind of lead so much better. Holding your pencil much further back is actually the better way to draw. Like I quite often hold my pencil like 6-8 inches back. Like this to me is a very sort of comfortable way to hold my pencil in order to get the results that I want. So sharpening your pencil this way actually does change the way you draw, and it changes it for the better. So earlier when I was talking about your drawing exercises, I mentioned something called a maul stick. And what this is a handy little tool that you keep around the studio, and it really helps you with your drawing. A maul stick means painter's stick in French. All this is a piece of doweling that I've got from the hardware store, and I've just wrapped some masking tape around the bottom of it so it doesn't scrape or scratch my artwork when I'm working with it. You use it by holding it with your non-working hand and then just resting it against the board or artwork that you're working on. And then you use the stick to actually prop your hand on while you're doing your artwork. And what this does is actually elevate your hand above the artwork so you don't smear or smudge the work while you're working on it. It also works as a steadying mechanism for your hand when you're in there trying to do very, very detailed and precise work, or you're trying to do a very fine edge or something that really needs a steadiness of hand. This is really a great handy little tool. It costs next to nothing and only takes a few minutes to make, and you'll use it for years and years around the studio. So go out and get a piece of doweling and make one of these for yourself, and you'll find that you'll use it quite a bit, particularly in the methods of drawing that we're going to be doing. So now we're going to make another little handy tool you can keep in the studio that will really help you with your drawing. Sometimes when we're working on a piece, we can really be struggling with an angle or a proportion or some darn thing, and we keep making the same mistake over and over and over again, and we just can't figure out why. Well, there's a reason for that. The fact is that our brains are wired to perceive the world around us in terms of recognizable patterns. And normally, this is a good thing. For instance, an abbreviated word, we can see just a couple of letters and we're able to fill in the blanks and we know exactly what that thing means. A black and white car, we know it's the police, a particular red shape, and we know it's a stop sign. Normally these perceptions help us navigate through life. But sometimes in the studio, this can actually work against us. For instance, we know that the human head is basically an oval shape with 2 eyes, nose, and a mouth. And sometimes we end up imposing our perceptions of those proportions and what we think it's supposed to look like, as opposed to what we're actually seeing in front of us. And we don't even realize that we're doing it. So what can we do about it? Well, the first thing we can do is actually become aware that that's what we're doing and mentally detach from that process and learn to actually step back and begin to really learn to look at what you're doing and develop your observational skills. That's the first thing. And the second thing that you can do is use one of these little things. It's called a black mirror, and it's a handy tool that you can keep around the studio that will help you see things far more objectively. Where do you get one? And how do you use it? Well, let's get started. So what we're going to need are just go to the local dollar store or the really, really cheap little place and get the cheapest little frames that you can find. These are 4x6 or 5x7 or whatever. And what we're actually looking for, we don't care about the frame. What we want is actually the glass that's inside the frame. That's what we're looking for. And it's just a really cheap and easy way to get that kind of glass without getting into cutting and all that sort of thing. It's just already pre-cut, it's inexpensive, and that's the easiest way to do that. So we're going to take both pieces of glass, so we need the 2 frames. So now we have the 2 pieces of glass. The next thing you're going to need is just a pair of scissors. You're going to need some black electrical tape. Usually, I mean, all these supplies I got just at a local dollar store. A utility knife, and a piece of black Bristol board or whatever, just some cheap black paper with a matte surface, and that's all you need. Then what you're going to do is you're just going to simply take one of your pieces of glass and you're just going to cut around it. Now don't forget to put a cutting mat under your work when you're doing this. That's it. You end up with a perfectly sized piece of glass. Then you take one piece of glass and your second piece of glass and you just put the paper in between the 2 pieces of glass and sandwich it. Then what you're going to do is take some of your electrical tape and just cut a piece off. Put it on the edge of the glass so you can fold it over the edge. Then you're just going to fold it over the edge of the glass. And then just trim the little extra bits off. And you're going to do this for all 4 sides. And there you have it. A nice little black mirror. So simple, takes a few minutes to make. So how do you use it? Well, first you just take the mirror and you hold it up to your brow line like this, and you look up into the mirror. And what you'll see is a perfectly clear reflection of what you're working on in front of you, upside down and in reverse. So when you do that and look at your artwork in front of you with your reference material side by side, and you're able to compare back and forth, what you'll notice is that the mistakes will begin to jump out at you. You'll start to see them a lot easier. And there's a reason for that. Because what you've done is break that recognizable pattern. And what appears to you now, instead of the face looking like the face, the vase is the face, the animal is the animal, whatever it is that you're doing or looking at, instead of being that thing that you have a preconceived idea about, what you're just seeing is an abstract series of shapes, proportions, and values. And suddenly, the little differences are far more easy to see. You're not navigating through your perceptions. You're just seeing what's in front of you. What this process does is actually allow you to just sort of step back, detach, and begin to see things far more objectively. You know, turning your work upside down in the studio has been an old trick that's been used forever for the same reason. But sometimes it just doesn't work to do that. It depends on the medium that you're using. Sometimes the piece is too big. It's just, there's sometimes the reasons it just doesn't work. And when you're working in realism, particularly in portraiture where accuracy really counts, having this little tool can really be of benefit around the studio. Now you have a solid understanding as to exactly what a construct is, and also how to do the site size measuring technique, as well as a few essential tools and how to use them properly. In the next drawing, we're going to begin the drawing process first by establishing the larger proportions and shapes before getting into any of the smaller details. And if you're interested in exploring more advanced techniques and would like to develop the skills to create beautiful and realistic portraits, you can. Simply go to my Patreon site and find out how. Thanks very much for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.